Good evening. My name is Szypula, and tonight I will be discussing the unconstitutionality of juvenile life without parole. I'd like to thank my panelist, Mr. Jack Campbell, for being here tonight. Mr. Campbell is the state attorney for the 2nd Judicial Circuit of Florida. On October 20th, 1983, 2 individuals were kidnapped, thrown into the trunk of a car, robbed and threatened by David Durham, who was 21, and Richard Kinder, who was only 17. Once they were in the trunk, Durham told Kinder that the 2 individuals had to die. Kinder protested, saying the 2 would not be able to identify them. Durham agreed that one had not looked at him. Kinder then got into the car and heard 5 gunshots. "You didn't shoot them, did you?" Kinder asked. While one victim died, the other survived. At trial, both Durham and Kinder were charged with capital murder, and Kinder received life without parole for his actions, even though Durham maintained that Kinder made none of the plans and did not shoot either victim. In 2012, through the cases of Evan Miller and Control Jackson, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in Miller v. Alabama that mandatory life without parole is unconstitutional for juvenile offenders under the 8th Amendment. Because of this ruling, Kinder received a resentencing hearing in 2017. Richard Jaffe, his attorney, said this about Kinder: "If there's anyone who deserves parole, it's this kid. Kinder was clean, married a volunteer, was in the faith-based dorms, only had 1 disciplinary infraction, and the judge, Judge Teresa Pulliam, said he had bettered himself." A year later, now 52 and eligible for parole, Kinder appeared before the board. He was denied parole on the spot with no explanation. For those sentenced prior to the 2012 decision, juvenile life without parole ensures that the juvenile will spend the rest of his or her life in prison. Many of these juveniles were subject to violence and abuse, both in their homes and while serving out their sentence. 79% of all juvenile offenders were exposed to violence in their homes regularly, and less than half were attending school at the time of their crime. Specifically in the case of female juvenile offenders, 80% were physically abused. These juveniles need rehabilitation and to be resentenced. Their brains are vastly different than that of an adult. Their age makes them legally different, and the court provides a separate system to prosecute their crimes.
Life without parole is supposed to be a judgment that says, this person is beyond hope, beyond redemption, beyond rehabilitation, has been given opportunities to change and hasn't changed, and therefore should be properly condemned for their commitment to criminality, to violence, to destruction. You can never say that about a child of 13 and 14. All kids do stupid things. All kids do bad things. Poor kids, kids who are living in the streets, kids who have no family, kids who are homeless, kids who are drug addicted, kids who have been subjected to a lot of trauma and violence and abuse tend to do bad things that are much worse. They can be violent, they can be criminal, but they're still kids. And their capacity to change is enormous. And to ignore that capacity to change is to deny their child's status, and I think that's cruel. It's no less cruel than making kids work in factories at 6 or 7, or subjecting kids to prostitution or abusing kids. All of that's wrong because kids have vulnerabilities and needs that have to be acknowledged and protected.
Juveniles' developing brains can be adversely affected by their environment, and these effects can result in making poor, even criminal decisions. Juveniles who commit crimes as a result of developmentally immature decisions suffer psychologically from the crime, the correctional system, and the sentencing. The length of the development of a person's brain lasts throughout childhood and well into adulthood. The first part of the brain to develop is the amygdala, which handles the fear and aggression. The last part of the brain to develop is the prefrontal cortex, which handles the reasoning and rational thinking. The connectivity between these two parts of the brain continues to grow as the brain matures. Because of this, adults understand that their actions have consequences and therefore have a better capability of evaluating the situation rather than acting out of the first emotion. Juveniles, however, because their brain is still developing, are subject to irrational outbursts and impulsivity, resulting in fights and violence. While they're acting out of this fear, aggression, and stress can make the juvenile's decision easier and quicker, it can also result in serious and unintended consequences because their judgment is clouded. The environment surrounding a juvenile can also have a negative effect on their behavior and brain development. Evan Miller was 14 when he and a friend, Colby Smith, brutally robbed and murdered Miller's neighbor, Cole Cannon. Cannon had been smoking marijuana and drinking alcohol with the two boys prior to his murder. Once Cannon fell asleep, Miller began to rob him. However, Cannon awoke in the midst of the robbery and an altercation ensued. Whether Miller was acting out of fear or under the influence, he began to beat his neighbor with a baseball bat before setting the trailer on fire, leaving Cannon to die. In 2006, Miller was sentenced to life without parole for his actions. Although the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry states in their research that drugs and alcohol have an effect on the person's brain, the drug and alcohol-fueled environment that Miller was subject to led him to believe his actions were appropriate. The detention center climate also has a negative effect on the juveniles' minds. After the death of 17-year-old Alorda Rolte in the detention center, the Miami Herald launched an investigation. It was discovered that underpaid officers were instigating violent fights between the juveniles. Using a tactic known as honeybutting, these juveniles were bribed with sweet treats in order to carry out these violent acts. Many of the juveniles targeted resulted with serious injuries, and some even died. Juvenile life without parole is psychologically damaging. The punishment and prison system both negatively affect their brain rather than a correctional effect that rehabilitation could provide. Juveniles and adults are considered different legally in many areas of the law, and therefore should be sentenced differently. Even the U.S. Supreme Court has recognized this difference. In Grand Verse, Florida, it extended the ruling of Miller v. Alabama, stating that life without parole for non-homicide offenses should not be allowed for a juvenile offender. It stated, life without parole is the second most severe penalty permitted by law and is especially harsh for a juvenile offender who will, on average, serve more years and a greater percentage of his life in prison than an adult offender. This brings up the valid point that life without parole means a completely different thing for a juvenile and an adult. If the average life expectancy is 75 to 80 years, if a 4-year-old is to receive this sentence, they would theoretically only serve 35 to 40 years. But a 14-year-old with the same sentence could serve 61 to 66 years. Calvin Wilson was one of those juveniles sentenced in 1997 at 17 years old, stated, "I know I took a guy's life, and I have to be punished for that. So I understand the punishment, but me being so young, I could be in here for 80 years. That's a long time." Other areas of the state and federal law also recognize this difference between juveniles and adults by placing age restrictions. Some of these restrictions include, at 16, we can receive our driver's license. 18, we can vote and enlist in the military. And at 21, we can legally buy alcohol and cigarettes. If we're separate in these aspects, we should be separate when it comes to punishing us in the justice system. O'Day Murray is another juvenile sentenced at 17 in 2007, stating, "You're sending someone to die in prison before they can even buy cigarettes. I'm still growing mentally and physically." A way to help these juveniles grow mentally and physically is through psychological therapy. Carla Green, the Program Director for Juvenile Justice Education in the Florida Department of Education, stated, "The first step should be an intensive, individual, therapeutic, psychiatric intervention. It can then move to group intensive intervention and eventually to the less intensive but effective evidence-based programs such as aggression replacement training and restorative justice. This could be the key to reversing the psychological damage of the crime and the sentence." Donald DeCoste, our title attritional vocational instructor for the state of New York prison system, stated from his experience, "A juvenile's mind is something that can be changed." The courts should recognize this juvenile youth and immaturity as different than adult irresponsibility. The justice system in the United States is comprised of two systems which prosecute juvenile crimes, the adult system and the juvenile system. However, giving them the option for either system is paramount. There are many ways that a juvenile can be tried as an adult, and these include the juvenile asking, a direct file, or the state's attorney or grand jury could order it. A direct file would be if the juvenile had already been convicted in the adult system and therefore would remain there for any future crime they commit. One advantage that the adult system will bring is the right to a jury trial. However, this also brings a disadvantage, as harsher, longer sentences are possible in the adult system. An advantage that counteracts this in the juvenile system is they can only remain in a detention center up until their 22nd birthday. This means that if a 17-year-old is tried and convicted for murder in the juvenile system, they could only receive around 5 years. However, if they were in the adult system, they could receive 5 times as many years, if not more. The Florida Department of Juvenile Justice states that its mission is to increase public safety by reducing juvenile delinquency through effective prevention, intervention, and treatment services that will turn around the lives of troubled youth. The DJJ works towards stronger, safer communities and healthy, positive relationships within families by putting the needs of the youths first. The juvenile system is built to help the juvenile offender return to society after serving out their punishment. There should be restrictions put in place that allow the juveniles to have the advantages of the adult system, yet they cannot receive harsh punishments like mandatory life without parole. This is why the 2012 Supreme Court decision is so important. It ruled that mandatory life without parole is not allowed for juvenile offenders, yet they can still be in the adult system and have a fair trial with all of its advantages. This is a balance between the adult system and the juvenile system for the juvenile offender. Even though both systems have their advantages and disadvantages for the juvenile, one thing remains the same. A juvenile should never be given life without parole for any crime they commit. Although the Supreme Court has ruled this punishment this mandatory punishment as unconstitutional, some disagree with this. In Chief Justice Roberts' dissent in regards to Miller v. Alabama, he stated that he believes there is nothing unusual about the punishment. He stated, "Determining the appropriate sentence for a teenager convicted of murder presents grave and challenging questions of morality and social policy. Our role, however, is to apply the law, not to answer such questions." The court invokes that amendment to ban a punishment that the court does not itself characterize as unusual and that could not plausibly be described as such. This is one judge's perspective, but another is through Jesus in the parable of the woman caught in adultery. When the woman is first brought to Jesus, he turns to the crowd and tells them, "Let him who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her." The people begin to leave, realizing that none of them are without sin. Jesus then turns to the woman and tells her, "Neither do I condemn you. Go, and from now on, sin no more." In this parable, Jesus is both the offended party and the judge, yet he still shows the woman mercy. In this same way, we should show these juveniles mercy, as we are all sinners. It is important, however, to remember that what the juvenile did was wrong and illegal, and should still be punished. But juvenile life without parole is too harsh, as their age needs to be take into account because a juvenile is vastly different than an adult. Juvenile offenders are still juveniles when the crime is taken away. Juvenile life without parole should be banned, as it has been ruled as an unconstitutional mandatory punishment as of 2012. These juveniles deserve to be given a second chance and should be given the option of parole. These youths could be used as a disciplinary example for other juveniles who are thinking of committing similar capital crimes. If these parolees were willing to share them, their stories could motivate other juveniles to reject a criminal future. Through the prison vocational courses, these juveniles will be able to be employed after being paroled. If the juveniles had a stable job opportunity after being released, they may not even think of reoffending. They would finally have a sense of stability in their lives other than the strict rules of the prison system. Juveniles have the capacity for change, and resentencing them is a step in this direction. Along with being resentenced, all juveniles should receive rehabilitation therapy. Juvenile life without parole is unconstitutional and unnecessary. Thank you.
Fantastic job grappling with some very difficult issues that they're working on at the Capitol today. Well, certainly juveniles can get out and do better. Would you agree with that? There are some who can come and commit terrible crimes even after being released.
Yes, that's always a possibility with anyone, whether a juvenile or an adult. They can always pretend, oh, I'm rehabilitated, I know what I did was wrong, I'm not going to do it again. There's always a possibility that they're going to reoffend.
Well, accepting that premise, what are we to do with people who, by their actions, have shown to be so dangerous? How do we protect our society from them by letting them free?
Well, they would still have, I wouldn't say give them parole immediately. I would say they still need to go through the same process every other juvenile is going through to be resentenced. However, I wouldn't say they should be given parole right away if they're that dangerous, and they should especially be given the rehabilitation therapy, as it can help reverse the psychological effects of whatever they've done, and they should be worked with until they're ready to be given parole or appear before the board and attempt to receive that parole.
Thank you very much.